On a busy Wednesday afternoon at the Cherry Hills Shopping Center, the usual hum of shoppers and rustling shopping bags filled the air. Mrs. Thompson, a 45-year-old high school teacher, walked confidently through the mall's gleaming corridors, her mind preoccupied with picking up supplies for her students' upcoming science fair. As she approached the entrance of a popular department store, she noticed a tall man in his 30s, wearing a crisp business suit, repeatedly glancing in her direction. At first, she thought nothing of it, but something about his demeanor made her uncomfortable. Years of teaching had given her a sixth sense about troubling situations. The man began following her, maintaining a distance of about 20 feet. Mrs. Thompson quickened her pace, her heart beginning to race. She could hear his footsteps getting closer as she turned down the home goods aisle. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of the self-defense classes she'd taken last summer. "You don't belong here," the man suddenly growled, his voice dripping with hatred. "This is a high-end store." His words cut through the air like ice, causing nearby shoppers to turn their heads. Mrs. Thompson stood her ground, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Sir, I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else here." She noticed a young store employee watching nervously from behind a display of kitchen appliances. The man's face contorted with anger. "I've been watching you. You've been following me around the store." His accusation was so absurd that Mrs. Thompson almost laughed, but she maintained her composure. "That's completely false," she replied firmly, pulling out her phone. "I'm a teacher shopping for my students' science fair. If you continue harassing me, I'll have to call security." Her calm response seemed to enrage him further. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "You people always play the victim card," he spat, his hands clenching into fists. Two elderly shoppers nearby gasped, and one immediately headed toward the customer service desk. Mrs. Thompson noticed this but kept her focus on the threatening man before her. Drawing from years of experience handling difficult situations in her classroom, Mrs. Thompson spoke loudly and clearly, "Sir, your behavior is inappropriate and is being recorded by security cameras. I suggest you step back and think about your actions." The man glanced up at the ceiling, suddenly aware of the cameras pointing in their direction. His momentary hesitation gave Mrs. Thompson the opportunity to create some distance between them. By now, other shoppers had gathered, forming a protective circle around Mrs. Thompson. A young woman in workout clothes stepped forward, phone in hand, already recording the incident. "I've got everything on video," she announced firmly. The store manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, rushed over with two security guards. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, positioning herself between Mrs. Thompson and the aggressive man. The man's demeanor suddenly shifted. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the crowd of witnesses surrounding him. Some had their phones out, recording his behavior. Others were shaking their heads in disapproval. "This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, adjusting his tie nervously. "There's been a misunderstanding." Mrs. Thompson, still maintaining her composure, addressed the manager. "This man has been following me through the store, making racist remarks and threatening me. I'd like to file a formal complaint." The security guards moved closer to the man, who was now backing away. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said firmly. As they led him away, he continued protesting, but his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd of witnesses began sharing their contact information with Mrs. Thompson, offering to provide statements about what they'd seen. The store manager apologized profusely, ensuring Mrs. Thompson that the man would be banned from the premises. She offered to escort her while she finished her shopping, but Mrs. Thompson politely declined. "I appreciate everyone's support," she said, addressing the concerned faces around her, "but I won't let this incident stop me from going about my day." Her voice carried the same strength and dignity she used in her classroom when teaching her students about respect and equality. The young woman who had recorded the incident approached Mrs. Thompson. "You handled that amazingly," she said, sharing her phone number. "If you need the video for any reason, please don't hesitate to contact me." As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Thompson continued her shopping, though her hands trembled slightly as she picked up items for the science fair. She thought about her students, about how this experience would become a teaching moment about standing up to injustice while maintaining one's dignity. Later that evening, as Mrs. Thompson sat in her quiet kitchen, she decided to share her story on social media. Not to seek attention or sympathy, but to show others that standing up to racism with grace and strength was possible. She wanted to demonstrate that one person's hatred shouldn't have the power to diminish another's spirit. Her post began, "Today, I experienced something that no one should ever have to face, but I chose to stand my ground with dignity." The responses began pouring in immediately, with messages of support and similar stories from others who had faced discrimination. A local community organization reached out, asking if she would speak at their upcoming event about dealing with discrimination. Mrs. Thompson agreed, seeing another opportunity to turn this negative experience into something positive. The incident at the mall became a catalyst for change in the community. The store implemented additional staff training on handling discrimination, and Mrs. Thompson's story inspired others to speak up against racism in their daily lives. As she prepared for bed that night, Mrs. Thompson thought about how different the outcome might have been if she had reacted with anger instead of composure, if the bystanders hadn't stepped in, if she hadn't known her rights. She was grateful for the support she'd received but remained determined to help create a world where such incidents would become a thing of the past. Tomorrow, she would face her students with an important lesson to share, one about courage, dignity, and the power of community support in the face of adversity. She knew this experience would make her an even better teacher and advocate for positive change. The following morning, Mrs. Thompson's story had already spread throughout the local community. As she pulled into the high school parking lot, her phone buzzed with notifications from people sharing messages of support and their own experiences with discrimination. Walking through the school hallways, she noticed groups of students huddled around their phones, watching the viral video of the incident. Some looked up as she passed, their eyes filled with a new kind of respect and understanding. Mrs. Thompson had always taught her students about standing up to injustice, but now they were seeing her words put into action. During her first period chemistry class, a usually quiet student raised her hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she began hesitantly, "we saw what happened to you yesterday. Would you be willing to talk about it?" The question hung in the air as 25 pairs of eyes focused on their teacher. Mrs. Thompson set down her dry erase marker and took a deep breath. This was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. "Yes," she replied, pulling up a chair to sit at the student's level. "I think this is an important discussion we need to have." The planned lesson about chemical reactions could wait. As she recounted the events, her students listened intently. She emphasized how maintaining composure and knowing your rights were crucial in such situations. "The most powerful weapon against hatred," she explained, "is not more hatred, but dignity and unity." One student shared how his grandmother had faced similar discrimination at a grocery store last month. Another described witnessing racist behavior on the bus but feeling too scared to speak up. The classroom became a safe space for honest dialogue about real-world issues. Meanwhile, across town, the incident was having ripple effects. The mall's management board called an emergency meeting to discuss implementing new anti-discrimination policies. The video of the confrontation had reached local news stations, prompting discussions about the ongoing reality of racism in their seemingly progressive community. The man from the incident, whose identity remained protected for legal reasons, had been placed on administrative leave from his position at a local firm. His employers released a statement condemning his actions and announcing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees. By lunchtime, Mrs. Thompson received a call from the local police department. They wanted to discuss filing formal charges against the man. The detective explained that multiple witnesses had come forward, and the store's security footage provided clear evidence of harassment. "We take these incidents very seriously," the detective assured her. "Your composed response and the community's support have made it easier for us to pursue this case." Mrs. Thompson agreed to press charges, not out of vengeance, but to send a message that such behavior would have consequences. She remembered the faces of her students and knew this was another teaching moment about accountability. That afternoon, the principal called her into his office. He had received numerous calls from parents praising how Mrs. Thompson handled the situation. "You've turned this terrible incident into a powerful lesson for our students," he said, suggesting they organize a school-wide assembly about standing up to discrimination. After school, Mrs. Thompson visited her favorite coffee shop, where the barista refused to let her pay for her drink. "You're an inspiration," the young barista said, sliding the cappuccino across the counter. "My mom saw the video and showed it to my little sister. It taught her that she doesn't have to be afraid to stand up for herself." As she sat in the coffee shop, Mrs. Thompson opened her laptop to find hundreds of supportive messages from around the country. People were sharing their own stories of confronting racism, inspired by her composed response to hatred. A local civil rights organization had invited her to be the keynote speaker at their upcoming conference. The email praised her for demonstrating how to respond to racism with dignity while ensuring accountability. Mrs. Thompson thought about how a simple shopping trip had transformed into something much bigger. She hadn't asked to be thrust into this position, but she recognized the responsibility that came with it. She began drafting her speech for the Civil Rights Conference, focusing on the importance of community support and the power of maintaining dignity in the face of hatred. Her words flowed naturally as she recalled the faces of those who stood with her in the store. As evening approached, Mrs. Thompson received another call, this time from a national morning show wanting to feature her story. They were particularly interested in how her experience as a teacher had influenced her response to the situation. She agreed to the interview, seeing another opportunity to spread a message of hope and resilience. However, she insisted that the focus should be on the larger issue of combating racism through education and community action, not just on her personal experience. Looking out the coffee shop window at the setting sun, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how one person's attempt to intimidate her had instead sparked a movement of solidarity and positive change in her community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she felt stronger knowing she wasn't facing them alone. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson woke up early to prepare for her television interview. As she sat in the local news station's makeup chair, she thought about how quickly life could change. Just 3 days ago, she had been an ordinary teacher, and now she was about to share her story with millions of viewers. The studio lights felt warm as the morning show host, a friendly woman in her 50s, leaned forward with genuine interest. "What gave you the courage to stand your ground in that moment?" she asked, once the cameras started rolling. Mrs. Thompson smiled thoughtfully. "In my classroom, I tell my students that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right even when you're afraid." At that moment, I thought about all the times I'd given that advice, and I knew I had to live up to those words. As she spoke, the station began receiving calls from viewers who were moved by her story. A mother called in, sharing how her daughter had faced bullying at school and how Mrs. Thompson's example had inspired them to address the situation head-on. During a commercial break, the host showed Mrs. Thompson her phone, where the hashtag #StandWithDignity was trending. People across the country were sharing their own stories of standing up to discrimination, each crediting her composed response as inspiration. After the interview, Mrs. Thompson headed to the police station to provide a formal statement. The detective handling her case revealed that 3 other women had come forward with similar experiences involving the same man at different stores. "Your courage in speaking up has encouraged others to do the same," the detective explained. The police station's waiting room was filled with local community leaders who had come to show their support. Among them was Dr. Chen, a renowned civil rights attorney who offered to take Mrs. Thompson's case pro bono. "Your story resonates with so many people," she explained. It's not just about one incident, it's about changing how we respond to hatred as a society. As they discussed the legal proceedings, Mrs. Thompson received a text from one of her students. The science fair projects were coming along wonderfully, and the class had decided to dedicate their exhibition to themes of unity and standing up against discrimination. Each project would now include a component about how science could help build a more inclusive world. Walking out of the police station, Mrs. Thompson noticed a small group of people holding signs that read "Teachers Against Hate" and "Dignity Wins." She recognized several colleagues from neighboring schools, all wearing their teaching badges proudly. One of her fellow teachers stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, hugging Mrs. Thompson. "Last year, I experienced something similar but was too afraid to speak up. Your story has given me the strength to file my own report." That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected call from the mall's corporate office. They wanted to partner with her to develop a comprehensive training program for their employees nationwide. The program would focus on recognizing and responding to discrimination in retail spaces. As she drove home, Mrs. Thompson passed the shopping center where everything had happened. The marquee now displayed a message: "Hate has no home here." The sight brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of hope for genuine change. At home, she found a pile of letters in her mailbox. Children from across the country had written to share their experiences and thank her for showing them how to stand up to bullies with dignity. One letter, written in crayon, simply said, "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Mrs. Thompson spent the evening responding to these letters, particularly touched by one from a young girl who had recently immigrated to America. The girl wrote about feeling scared in her new country but finding courage in Mrs. Thompson's story. As she wrote her responses, Mrs. Thompson's phone lit up with a notification. The local school board had unanimously voted to implement a new anti-discrimination curriculum, and they wanted her to help develop it. The curriculum would focus on practical strategies for responding to discrimination while maintaining one's dignity. Later that night, as she prepared materials for the next day's classes, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how education had always been her tool for change. Now, her experience would become a real-world lesson in standing up to injustice, not just for her students, but for people across the country. She recalled something her grandmother used to say: "When life gives you darkness, become a light for others." The incident at the mall had been an attempt to diminish her, but instead, it had amplified her voice and message of dignity and resilience. Before going to bed, Mrs. Thompson added a final note to her lesson plan for tomorrow. Beyond teaching chemistry and physics, she would help her students understand that their voices mattered, that standing up for what's right might be frightening, but it was always worth it. The overwhelming support she'd received proved that while racism still existed, so did countless people willing to stand against it. Her story had become more than just a viral video, it had become a movement about choosing dignity over fear, unity over division, and hope over hatred. The following week brought unexpected developments. Mrs. Thompson arrived at school to find a group of parents waiting outside her classroom. Their faces weren't angry or confrontational, instead, they wore expressions of gratitude and determination. A parent stepped forward, introducing herself as Mrs. Rodriguez, a local business owner. "We've started a community initiative," she explained, holding up a professionally designed brochure. "It's called Dignity First, and we want you to be part of it." The initiative, they explained, would provide free workshops teaching people how to respond to discrimination safely and effectively. They had already secured funding from several local businesses, including the mall where the incident occurred. During her morning chemistry class, Mrs. Thompson noticed how her students' behavior had subtly changed. They were more attentive, not just to the lessons, but to each other. When a new student stumbled over an answer, instead of the usual snickers, classmates offered encouragement. At lunchtime, the school cafeteria buzzed with excitement. The student council had organized a peaceful demonstration for the following week. Their plan wasn't to protest, instead, they wanted to celebrate diversity through a cultural exchange fair. "We got the idea from you, Mrs. Thompson," explained the student council president during their lunch meeting. "Fighting hatred with anger never works. But when you show people the beauty of our differences, it's harder for them to hold on to their prejudices." That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected visitor. The young store employee who had witnessed the incident came to her classroom after school. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I've been feeling guilty," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have done more to help that day. I was scared of losing my job, but that's no excuse." She paused, gathering courage. "I've quit my job at the mall. I'm going back to college to become a teacher. I want to make a difference like you do." Mrs. Thompson listened compassionately, understanding the complex emotions the young woman was processing. "Fear is natural," she assured her. "What matters is that you're choosing to grow from this experience." Later that day, while grading papers, Mrs. Thompson's phone rang. It was the detective handling her case with an update. The man from the incident had requested a meeting through his lawyer. He wanted to apologize in person. The suggestion made Mrs. Thompson's stomach twist. The detective quickly assured her that she wasn't obligated to accept, but something in Mrs. Thompson's teacher's heart told her this could be an opportunity for real change. After careful consideration and consultation with her lawyer, Mrs. Thompson agreed to a mediated meeting at the police station. She spent the evening preparing herself mentally, remembering that true strength often meant being open to difficult conversations. The following morning, before the meeting, she received a surprise delivery in her classroom. It was a handmade quilt from a senior citizens crafting group in a nearby town. Each patch contained messages of support and encouragement, stitched with care and solidarity. As she traced the intricate stitching with her fingers, Mrs. Thompson thought about how her personal experience had woven together so many different people from all walks of life. Each person who reached out added another thread to this tapestry of community support. At the police station, sitting across from the man who had threatened her, Mrs. Thompson maintained the same composure she'd shown at the mall. The man looked different now, smaller somehow, his expensive suit replaced by casual clothes, his arrogance replaced by shame. "I've lost everything," he began, his voice hoarse. "My job, my reputation, my friends. But the worst part is knowing that I became exactly what I always claimed to hate, a bully, a person who hurts others." Mrs. Thompson listened as he explained how the video had forced him to confront his own prejudices. His teenage daughter had refused to speak to him after seeing it. His elderly mother had called him in tears, asking where she had gone wrong in raising him. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want you to know that you've taught me something. Your dignity that day showed me my own lack of it. I'm starting counseling, and I'm working with anti-racism organizations to change." Mrs. Thompson's response was measured but genuine. "Change isn't easy," she said, "but it's always possible. The same dignity you saw in me that day exists in every person you meet. Remember that." As she left the police station, Mrs. Thompson felt a complex mix of emotions. The meeting hadn't erased the trauma of the incident, but it had added another layer to the lesson she could share with her students, about the possibility of transformation and the power of confronting one's own prejudices. Driving back to school, she passed a billboard that had been updated with a new message: "Stand with dignity, change starts with us." The sight reminded her that while personal healing was important, the wider impact of her story continued to ripple through the community. That evening, as she sat in her classroom preparing for the next day's lessons, Mrs. Thompson added a new topic to her teaching plans. Beyond the science curriculum, she would help her students understand that true strength often lies in offering others the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. As weeks passed, Mrs. Thompson's story continued to create ripples of change. One morning, she arrived at school to find news crews setting up their equipment in the gymnasium. The cultural exchange fair organized by her students had caught national attention. What started as a simple school event had grown into a community-wide celebration. Local restaurants donated dishes representing their cultural heritage. Parents arrived wearing traditional clothing, ready to share stories of their family's journeys. Even the mayor had cleared her schedule to attend. "This is more than just a fair," the student council president explained to a reporter. "This is our way of showing that our differences make our community stronger." She gestured to the bustling gymnasium, where students were hanging flags from different nations alongside hand-painted banners promoting unity. Mrs. Thompson watched with pride as her chemistry students demonstrated how different elements combined to create something new and beautiful, a metaphor they developed themselves to explain the importance of diversity in their community. During the fair, a group of elderly women approached Mrs. Thompson. They were the quilters who had sent her the supportive quilt. "We've started a new project," their leader explained, showing her photos on a tablet. "We're making quilts for other people who stand up to hatred. We call them dignity quilts." The local news coverage of the fair caught the attention of a prominent civil rights museum. They contacted Mrs. Thompson with an unusual request. They wanted to display the security camera footage from the mall incident alongside stories of other ordinary people who had stood up to discrimination throughout history. "Your story resonates because it shows how everyday moments can become movements," the museum curator explained during their phone call. "It's not about being a superhero, it's about being human and choosing dignity." That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received an email from a teachers' organization in another state. They had used her story to develop a conflict resolution curriculum for schools. The program, called Dignity in Action, was already being piloted in several districts. During her planning period, Mrs. Thompson noticed one of her typically withdrawn students lingering after class. The girl approached her desk hesitantly, clutching a journal to her chest. "I've been writing about what happened to you," the student said softly. "But also about what happened to my family." She shared how her parents had faced discrimination when they first opened their small business. "Your story helped me understand that we don't have to be ashamed of these experiences. We can use them to help others." Later that day, Mrs. Thompson attended a community meeting at the local library. The mall's corporate office had followed through on their promise to implement new training programs. The first group of employees had completed their training, and the results were encouraging. A security guard who had witnessed the incident shared his perspective. "Before, we were taught to just call the police if there was trouble. Now we're learning how to actively support people facing discrimination while keeping everyone safe." The meeting was interrupted by excited murmurs as people checked their phones. The state legislature had just passed a bill strengthening penalties for bias-motivated harassment. Local activists had used Mrs. Thompson's story during their testimony supporting the bill. Walking home that evening, Mrs. Thompson passed several small businesses displaying new window signs, "All welcome here, stand with dignity." The signs had become a symbol of the movement that grew from her experience, though she still felt humble about her role in it. At home, she found an invitation in her mail. A national teachers' conference wanted her to lead a workshop on creating inclusive classrooms. The topic wasn't just about handling discrimination, it was about building environments where dignity and respect became the natural response to differences. As she prepared dinner, Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen, her lawyer. The civil rights attorney had news. Several major retailers had reached out about collaborating on customer service training programs. They wanted to prevent similar incidents in their stores. Mrs. Thompson sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the latest batch of letters from people around the country. One caught her eye, a note from a retail worker in another state who had intervened when witnessing a similar situation in his store. "I remembered your story," he wrote, "and instead of staying quiet, I spoke up. The whole store stood together, and the person causing trouble left. You showed us that one person's courage can give others permission to be brave too." Before bed, Mrs. Thompson added to the journal she'd been keeping since the incident. She wrote about how standing up to hatred wasn't a single moment of bravery, but a continuous choice to believe in the possibility of change. She thought about the man from the mall, who was now working with anti-racism organizations. His transformation reminded her that education, whether in a classroom or through life experiences, had the power to open minds and hearts. Tomorrow would bring more challenges and opportunities. The movement that started with her experience had taken on a life of its own, creating change in ways she never could have imagined. But for Mrs. Thompson, the most important impact was still in her classroom, where she could help shape the next generation's response to hatred and discrimination. 2 months after the incident, Mrs. Thompson received an invitation that would take her story in an unexpected direction. The superintendent of schools wanted her to help develop a district-wide program about building inclusive communities. One morning, as she walked into the district office, she was greeted by a diverse group of educators, counselors, and community leaders. They had gathered to share their expertise and experiences, all inspired by how a single moment of dignity had sparked widespread change. "My students don't just want to learn about chemistry anymore," Mrs. Thompson shared during the meeting. "They want to understand how to make their world better." She explained how her students now started each class by sharing examples of kindness they'd witnessed or performed. A guidance counselor raised her hand. "The number of students reporting bullying has increased," she said. "Not because there's more bullying, but because they're no longer afraid to speak up. They keep saying, 'If Mrs. Thompson could stand up to that man, I can stand up to this.'" During lunch break, Mrs. Thompson checked her email to find a message from an unexpected source. A producer from a major streaming service wanted to create a documentary about how communities can transform incidents of hate into opportunities for positive change. As she considered the offer, a group of teachers from her school arrived at the district office. They had been implementing small changes in their classrooms, subtle ways to make every student feel valued and heard. One math teacher had started including word problems that reflected different cultural experiences. An art teacher had begun a project about expressing identity through creativity. "The students are different now," one teacher explained. "When someone makes an insensitive comment, other students speak up. They don't wait for adults to intervene anymore." That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson visited a local community center where the "Dignity First" workshops were in full swing. People from all walks of life gathered to learn practical strategies for confronting discrimination while staying safe. A young mother approached her after the workshop, pushing a stroller. "I was at the mall that day," she revealed. "I was too scared to help, and that shame has haunted me. But now I'm learning how to be brave, not just for myself but for my daughter." Later that evening, Mrs. Thompson attended a meeting with the mall's management team. They had transformed their security protocols, training staff to recognize and respond to discrimination. The changes were showing positive results. Several incidents had been peacefully resolved before escalating into confrontations. The mall's customer service desk now featured a prominent sign, "Report harassment, we stand with you." Security guards had been equipped with body cameras, and a new rapid response team was specifically trained to handle discrimination-related incidents. As she walked through the mall, Mrs. Thompson noticed other changes. Store windows displayed diverse mannequins. Signs were now in multiple languages. Small touches that sent a big message: everyone belongs here. Back home, Mrs. Thompson found a package waiting on her doorstep. Inside was a bound collection of letters from students across the country. They had written about how her story had affected their lives, each letter a testament to the ripple effect of choosing dignity over fear. One letter particularly touched her heart. A high school senior wrote about how she'd always stayed silent when hearing racist comments, afraid of drawing attention to herself. "Now I understand that my silence was part of the problem," the student wrote. "Yesterday, I spoke up for the first time. It was scary, but it felt right." Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. The civil rights organization they'd been working with had secured funding for a nationwide campaign. Digital billboards would soon display messages promoting unity and courage in the face of discrimination. As she prepared for bed, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how the incident had changed not just her community, but herself. She was no longer just a chemistry teacher, she had become a living lesson in the power of dignity and resilience. Her phone lit up with another notification. The local news station wanted to do a follow-up story about the changes in the community since the incident. They were particularly interested in how schools were approaching the topic of discrimination differently. Before turning in, Mrs. Thompson added another entry to her journal. She wrote about how true change doesn't happen in grand gestures but in small, daily choices to stand up for what's right. Each person who chose dignity over hatred, each student who found the courage to speak up, each community that decided to do better, these were the real victories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But Mrs. Thompson knew that her community was stronger now, more prepared to face whatever came their way. The lesson she'd taught through her actions continued to educate and inspire, proving that one person's dignity could indeed change countless lives. 6 months after the incident, Mrs. Thompson stood at the podium of a national education conference. The audience of 3,000 teachers fell silent as she began to speak about how a single moment in a shopping mall had transformed into a movement. Education isn't just about textbooks and tests, she began, her voice steady and clear. It's about teaching our students to create the world they want to live in. The giant screens behind her displayed photos of various community initiatives that had sprung up since the incident. During her speech, Mrs. Thompson noticed a group of students from her school sitting in the front row. They had been invited to present their own project, a peer mentoring program that helped students stand up against discrimination. Their presence reminded her that the youngest generation often led the way in creating change. After the presentation, a line of educators waited to speak with her. One teacher from a small rural school fought back tears as she shared her story. "We didn't think racism was an issue in our community because nobody talked about it. Your story gave us permission to start those difficult conversations." That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received a call from the mall's corporate headquarters. The training program they had developed together was showing remarkable results. Incident reports had decreased by 60%, and customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. "We're implementing the program nationwide," the corporate director explained. "Other retailers are asking to adapt it for their stores. You've helped create a new standard for retail customer service." Back at school, Mrs. Thompson's classroom had become a model for inclusive education. Teachers from other districts often visited to observe how she integrated lessons about dignity and respect into her science curriculum. During a chemistry experiment about catalysts, she overheard 2 students discussing how one person's actions could speed up positive change in a community, just like a catalyst speeds up a chemical reaction. The scientific principle had become a metaphor for social transformation. After school, Mrs. Thompson attended a community council meeting. The Dignity First initiative had expanded beyond its original scope. Local businesses had joined together to create a scholarship fund for students who demonstrated leadership in promoting inclusion and understanding. A small business owner stood up to share his perspective. "When I first heard about what happened at the mall, I thought it was just another terrible incident that would be forgotten. But Mrs. Thompson showed us how to turn anger into action, hate into hope." The meeting was interrupted by excited whispers as news spread through the room. The state's education department had just announced plans to incorporate anti-discrimination training into teacher certification requirements. The curriculum would include case studies from their community's transformation. On her drive home, Mrs. Thompson passed the mall where everything had started. The parking lot was full, a stark contrast to the weeks following the incident when many had boycotted the location. Now it stood as a symbol of how a community could learn and grow from its darkest moments. At home, she found an envelope from the young store employee who had witnessed the incident. The young woman had completed her first semester of education courses and wanted to share her experience. "In my teaching practicum, I tell my students about that day," she wrote. "Not just about the hatred I witnessed, but about the strength I saw in you." It's helping them understand that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is unwavering dignity. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. The documentary about their community's transformation had been picked up by a major streaming service. The producers wanted to focus on how everyday people had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for lasting change. Later that evening, Mrs. Thompson attended a community dinner organized by local religious leaders. People of different faiths and backgrounds sat together, sharing meals and stories. The event had become a monthly tradition, breaking down barriers through simple human connection. A local imam approached her table. "Before all this happened, different faith communities barely spoke to each other," he said. "Now we're working together on projects, supporting each other, showing our children that differences don't have to divide us." As she prepared for bed that night, Mrs. Thompson reviewed the draft of a book she was writing. Publishers had approached her months ago, but she had waited until she could see the long-term impact of the community's changes before sharing their story. The book wasn't just about her experience at the mall. It was about how communities can choose to respond to hatred with unity, how education can transform prejudice into understanding, and how ordinary people can become extraordinary when they stand together for what's right. Before turning out the light, Mrs. Thompson added one more entry to her journal. She wrote about how true change isn't measured in days or weeks, but in the subtle shifts that happen in people's hearts and minds over time. The incident at the mall hadn't just been about standing up to one person's hatred, it had been about showing an entire community their own capacity for growth and transformation. 1 year after the incident, Mrs. Thompson sat in her backyard, reflecting on how a single moment had created such lasting change. The morning sun filtered through the trees as she reviewed her speaking notes for the upcoming anniversary event. The community had organized a Unity in Action festival to commemorate not the incident itself, but the positive transformation that followed. The local park would host cultural performances, educational workshops, and community organizations sharing resources for promoting inclusion. Her phone chimed with a text from a former student who now attended college out of state. "Professor asked us to write about someone who inspired social change. I wrote about you, Mrs. Thompson. My classmates couldn't believe how one person standing up with dignity could transform an entire community." As she drove to the festival, Mrs. Thompson noticed how the city had changed. Store windows displayed "All are welcome" signs in multiple languages. Local businesses had diversity statements proudly posted. Even the smallest shops had protocols for handling discrimination. The park was already bustling when she arrived. Families spread blankets on the grass, children played together on the playground, and the air filled with music from different cultures. The fear and tension that had gripped the community a year ago had been replaced by a sense of collective purpose. The mall's new management team had set up an information booth about their reformed policies. Since implementing the Dignity First protocols, the manager explained to visitors, "We've become a model for other shopping centers across the country. Our incident response team now trains security staff nationwide." Mrs. Thompson watched as her current and former students led workshop sessions about creating inclusive spaces in schools. They spoke with confidence about the importance of standing up to discrimination, sharing practical strategies they developed themselves. A group of teenagers demonstrated role-playing scenarios, teaching younger children how to be active allies when witnessing bullying or discrimination. Their presentation included tips for staying safe while speaking up, lessons learned from Mrs. Thompson's experience. During lunch, she sat with the quilting group whose support had meant so much during the difficult days after the incident. They had turned their Dignity Quilts project into a national movement, sending handmade quilts to people who stood up against hatred across the country. "We've made over 500 quilts now," one quilter said proudly. "Each one carries messages of hope and solidarity. People tell us these quilts remind them they're not alone when they choose to stand up for what's right." The afternoon program began with a surprise announcement. The City Council had established an annual Dignity in Action award, recognizing individuals who promoted unity and understanding in the community. Mrs. Thompson was honored as its first recipient, though she insisted on sharing the recognition with all who had worked for positive change. As she accepted the award, Mrs. Thompson spoke about how the incident had taught her that community transformation happens through thousands of small choices. Each time we choose dignity over hatred, understanding over fear, we build the world we want to live in, she said, her voice carrying across the crowded park. The festival's most powerful moment came during the Story Circle, where community members shared their experiences of positive change over the past year. A local business owner described how he'd confronted his own prejudices. A teenager talked about standing up to racist jokes in her social circle. A grandfather shared how his grandchildren had taught him to question his long-held biases. The man from the original incident had asked to send a message to be read at the festival. His words, read by a community leader, spoke of his continuing journey to unlearn hatred and make amends. He was now working with anti-racism organizations in another state, using his experience to show others how prejudice harmed both its targets and its carriers. As evening approached, Mrs. Thompson joined a group of young teachers she had mentored throughout the year. They discussed how their classrooms had become spaces where students felt empowered to address discrimination and celebrate differences. The most amazing thing, one new teacher said, is how the students have taken ownership of these changes. They're not waiting for adults to fix things anymore. They're creating the community they want to inherit. The festival concluded with a candlelight ceremony. Thousands of people stood together, their lights creating a gentle glow in the growing darkness. The moment symbolized how individual actions, joined together, could illuminate the path forward. Later that night, Mrs. Thompson made the final entry in the journal she'd kept since the incident. She wrote about how real change wasn't just about standing up to obvious acts of hatred, but about the daily work of building understanding, challenging biases, and choosing dignity in every interaction. As she closed the journal, Mrs. Thompson thought about all the lessons this year had taught her community. They had learned that transformation was possible when people chose unity over division, that education was the key to lasting change, and that every person had the power to stand up for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but their community was ready to face them together. The incident that could have divided them had instead shown them their capacity for growth, understanding, and collective action. In choosing dignity over hatred, they had not just responded to a single act of discrimination, they had created a blueprint for positive change that would guide generations to come.